Okay, so now we're going to move on to the brain. There we go. Okay, so with the brain, we're going to look at parts of the brain and the structure of the brain to understand the whole mind-brain connection and to think about how we can begin to model that, so connecting back to artificial intelligence and the processing systems debate and algorithms, that sort of thing. So we have to understand the basic structures to be able to talk about these sorts of things. Okay? This is still chapter 1 at the end. So why should we even studying the brain? The idea of identifiability is the ability to specify those mental representations and those mental processes used in a task. So it's the way that we figure out all of those mental pieces. So how do we know people are imagining a picture of something versus that propositional representation of like the ball is on the box, but it's written in sort of computer terms? And then what processes helped us get there? So we're going to move into perception after this chapter, but thinking about what part of the brain does vision will really help us understand that idea of mental representation. Okay? So identifiability is probably the biggest component. What pieces do what, and how do those work? The facts about the brain can help us test the adequacy of a theory. So we'll get into this into the next module, but if I have this computer model and this theory, I can look at the brain and make sure that matches. Because if the brain does not have the sections that I am describing in my model, that doesn't really make any sense. So it's a way to test if theories are sort of validated by using the brain as well as the human data, so the participants output in an experiment. And we'll talk about both in the next section. So a little bit of an outline for you. We've got a study of neurons, so the building blocks of the brain. We're going to move on to the structure of the nervous system. So thinking about the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, the whole bottom half of your body. Not a whole lot on that because it's more biology. We're mostly going to focus on the brain since this is cognition, but a little bit on the peripheral nervous system. The cerebral cortex, this whole thing up here, and a little bit of the subcortical areas. So the book is going to cover a little more of the subcortical areas, like the limbic system. I'll tell you the two that I think are particularly interesting that you should know. So starting with the neuron. So neurons we're going to work from the smallest piece to the largest piece. So neurons are the building blocks of the brain. Okay, so why do we even care about these little neuron things? Let me show you a picture. My computer is a Mac, so it doesn't really do the little video thing, but you might be able to if you want to look at the PowerPoints online. But there are different types of neurons, so these are the different examples of what they sort of look like. So they kind of look like trees. We'll get into where the tree name comes from. And there are the pieces that make up our brain. So it's kind of hard to think about the gray, squishy looking thing that you think of as a brain being all these little bitty neural cells. But this is what the brain is made of. Actually, it's what most of your body is made of, but this is super important for the brain. So we're going to talk about the types of neurons. So there are several different types, like you saw in the last picture. The pieces of them, so all the little parts. If you want to open the new brain sheet Word document, you can sort of follow along. I'm going to flip back and forth. How do they communicate with each other and within the neuron and outside the neuron? So communication occurs like within each cell and then between cells, which I'm going to call the Mexican wave because it's the way I learned it, and it's just sort of a memory mnemonic to help you get how the communication within a cell works. And neurotransmitters are the communication between cells. We'll talk a little bit about drugs. So if you've heard about depression drugs or SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, those are things that affect the communication between cells, which help us deal with some psychological distress issues. So let's start with types. There are really three types. First type is a sensory neuron. and those are activated by the sense organs. So your skin is a giant set of sensory neurons. So the touch sensation, your eyes contain lots of sensory neurons for color. So these are anything that is sort of input neurons to the sensory system. There are motor neurons, which are activated by movement. So your muscles are giant collections of motor neurons. All of the ligaments that help move connections. So those have a specific, are separated from the sensory neurons. And then everything else in between. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for sensory neurons, let's say the sensation for your toes, to be connected directly to the sensation area of your brain, which is about right here. Okay. If that was one long neuron and you had an accident, you were screwed. No more toes. So, not quite, but you get the idea. So it helps if you have neurons in between that connect the message from wherever that sensory piece is coming from to the actual part of your brain that interprets the sensory pieces. So inner neurons are kind of doing all the work. It's just that the sensory neurons are the ones that pick up the senses, and the motor neurons are the ones that pick up the movement. Inner neurons are the like messenger systems between the two, between the brain part that controls it and the actual piece neuron on your body. Alright, so here's my structure of a neuron. And I'm going to walk through all the different terms that you need to know, which are listed on the next slide. But you'll want to pull up this picture. I'm going to pull it up myself here. And be able to write some notes on it. Okay. So let's go back and look here at our list of things that we need to know for the parts. Okay. Alright, so let me start with the dendrites. I'll make this just a little bigger. There we go. Okay, so dendrites are here. So the word looks like tree. These pieces look like a tree, so the word is for tree, so that's where the name comes from. And dendrites are the receivers on the system. Okay, so they're the ones taking the message in. So they're kind of branching out, if you will, to get a message on move your arm this way, or ooh, don't touch that, it's hot, or oh hey, that smells nice. So any kind of message you can think of. Okay. And so they're just little branches out here on the end of a neuron that receive the message that another neuron is sending it. So it's the starting block, if you will. Okay. Next one is the cell body. So the cell body is sort of how the neuron stays alive. So it does all the like maintenance functions. It keeps the cell in place. And so this is just sort of the the kitchen, if you will. So this is what keeps the cell cooking. Sometimes this is called the soma, which is spelled S-O-M-A, which is the more biology terminology that you'll see. So once the message comes in at the dendrites, it passes through the cell body. All the super important work goes on here, down the axon. So the axon is this small little yellow tube that you see here. And what that is a TV cable. It is where the or an internet cable, if you will, the message is going to be sent along down the axon. So all of that, all that message sending is really occurring down this axon piece. So it's just sort of a long, thin sort of cable that helps us transmit the message. Let's see what's next. Myelin. So this myelin sheath here are these little white bubbles. If you want to think about it as a TV cable, this is the coating on the TV cable so you don't fry yourself. And what myelin does for us is it's sort of a lubricant. It helps speed things up. So normally when it has to travel down the axon without any myelin, we're not born with this, and it has to take each little step. So it's kind of like having to walk through the train station. What myelin does is it helps us skip all the steps. So I have to stop and think here, I have to stop and think here. So you are having to, like, you can make jumps as opposed to taking each little step one at a time. I can jump from point A to point B, so it's like the express train. It's much faster. So we're not born with this myelin. Myelination occurs throughout development, and it starts in the back and works its way forward. Okay, so if you've ever thought little kids are kind of slow, I'm kidding, of course, it's because the area that does abstract thinking up here on the frontal lobe is the last place to get myelinated. So that's like an important component if you think about culpability for court systems, how children are not considered, like, they can't do that sort of abstract thinking until about 12 years of age. That's because of myelination. So understanding these little pieces and their application to your everyday life. So myelination is sort of the system that helps us think a lot faster because the message is going faster. The terminal buttons down here are axon terminals. These little knob-looking things are the message transcenders to the next dendrites. So these are connected, kind of like in a tree format, but the branches don't touch. Okay, this is all electric. If they touched, they'd fry each other. Okay. So what happens is the message gets sent down the axon. We're going to talk about the action potential here in another couple slides. To the terminal buttons. So it starts at the dendrite, goes through the cell body, goes down the axon. If it's myelinated, it's much faster. Boop, boop, boop. And then it hits these terminal buttons. So what happens at the end is the terminal buttons go, ooh, we should send this message on to the next neuron. Or they go, no, never mind, not important. So that is where it gets on to inner neuron connection, messaging, as opposed to just within the same cell. Make sure I haven't missed anything. Okay, the synapse. The synapse is the space between cells. So synapse is not really like a thing you can touch. It's the space from the dendrites of one to the terminal buttons of the other. So like I said, they're electric. If they touched, they would fry each other. Not quite, but that's a good way to remember it. And so there's a space between the two that lets the message be sent from one to the other without it being all electric. Okay, so the stuff in the synapse is all chemical. So this is an electrochemical process. Everything here in the neuron is electric. Okay? And that's why some of the really cool brain imaging systems we're going to talk about are electrified. Okay? And then everything between neurons, the connection is chemical. And that's where the neurotransmitters come in. So let me flip back to my notes here. There it goes. A swap. There we go. Okay, so we talked about the dendrites. Just a reminder, they're the beginning of a neuron. They're the tree components that pick up messages. Cell body is what's keeping the neuron alive because it's still a cell. The axon is where the message is being sent down the neuron. If our axons are myelinated, the process goes much faster, so it's the coating on the TV cable that helps smooth things along. And the terminal buttons are the end of the neuron where the message gets sent to the next neuron. So terminal end, it's kind of like a train station, but again, myelin is where it makes it the express train much faster. And then the synapse is a space between the two neurons so that they don't get their wires crossed. Talk about a couple of extra little things that are important but not quite part of the neuron. There are these cells called glial cells. Okay, I'm from the South, and there are lots of cows, so I'm from Texas. And I don't know if you've seen cows with little birds on them, but we call them cowbirds. They have a real name, who knows. But they help keep the bugs off the cow. So they're a support system. Glial cells are the neuron's support system. So what happens is they hold them in place. If you watch any of the videos on neurons, they look like they're kind of floating in space. Well, they're not. They're just not showing you all the other cells that are holding the neurons in a place so they don't touch each other. And that is what the glial cell does. It also helps the cell body do all of the basic cell processing, cleaning, that kind of stuff. the receptors are on the dendrites. So to receive that message, I have to have some sort of system that lets me know what message is being sent. So the receptors are all the little pieces on the dendrite of the next neuron that say, oh, look, this is the, oh, it's too hot, don't touch that kind of message, versus, oh, this smells really strong. Okay, so receptors are the information processors for the dendrites. And then what is telling me what the message is are my neurotransmitters. So once it hits the terminal buttons send out these neurotransmitters. They're chemical, things like serotonin and dopamine. And those neurotransmitters travel across the synapse and bind with a receptor, got a picture here in a second, that says, here's the message we're trying to send. Send it on or don't, but here's the message. Okay? So this is all occurring in the synapse, in that space. Alright, so let's talk about the Mexican wave. This is how my Australian professor, who swore she was Mexican, explained it to us. Never figured that one out. But really, you can just think about this as the wave. So, like the wave, like at soccer games, they do the wave. Okay? And it's a way to understand the internal neuron connections. Excuse me. And so this is a way to think about how it goes from dendrites down the axon through the terminal buttons. Okay. So we're going to watch a YouTube video because it's amazing about the action potential, which is what the Mexican wave is sort of a mnemonic for. Let's see if I can get that loaded here. Hopefully my YouTube video still works here. Perfect. All right. So this is a dance interpretation of the Mexican wave. Come on now. There it goes. So we're going to fly forward to 344. You can watch the whole thing. It's great. But really, everything starts about here. Ooh, that's terrible. All right. So we're trying to blow it up here, but it may not be the best quality. Okay, so let me pause this real quick. What's going on? This is their interpretation of a neuron. So these are the dendrites. See how their arms are sticking out everywhere? Those are supposed to be the message receivers. The message person's over here. Okay, this is the axon here. Why are some people laying on the ground? Those are the myelinated areas. So the people who are standing up are stops on the express train where you have to stop to send the message, but the people laying on the ground are the myelination, so you don't have to stop. It makes it much faster, less people. Okay? So first thing we're going to do is have the dendrites receive a message. This was done by a dance class, so it's slightly interpretive dance. It's a great video. Right. And these girls in the colored outfits are sort of message senders. They're not neurotransmitters. Here's our neurotransmitter. He's going to grab one of these dendrites and say, hey, here's a message. So this person would be a receptor, and he would be the neurotransmitter, and there's a space here, the synapse. So what's happening here is he sent this message, but it's not strong enough. So we're going to talk about how action potentials are go, no go. There's no half doing anything. So not quite enough message. That's why she falls down and nothing happens. There's some more action. These two are meant to be inhibitory, meaning this is the don't send a message. So they're still not exciting enough. And now we're going to get some exciting messages. So there's more go action than no go action. So she's going to be able to send the message here in a second. I don't know if it's quite like a fight like this, but it's interpretive dance. Alright, why does she have a banana? What's going on right here is this is the sodium-potassium pump. Okay. So they have little NAs on their shirt and they're throwing bananas. So what happens is there's a spot here where it tries to figure out how do I want to fire. And this is all electric, so sodium and potassium are one's positive and one's negative, and it sort of pumps out the negative ions and takes in the positive ions. So neurons get more positive as they're sending messages. Just in the sense of electricity, it's more of a positive volt than a negative volt. Not like happy or sadness. And so they are throwing out bananas, and so they're taking in the positive ions. And so that's why the sodium potassium banana throwing. See, the message is only being sent to these people standing up. She's reached the terminal buttons. This is a calcium-based thing, so they're going to throw milk at them. And then the next neurotransmitters are released. Alright, let's go back to the notes here. So that whole thing is Mexican wave. Okay? So I've got the link for you so you can watch it again if you want. So what's happening? It's an electrochemical process. And that whole thing is called the action potential. And so here's what happens. And when the dendrites receive the message, that's sort of you sitting there going, are we really going to do the wave? I really don't want to do the wave. Why are we doing the wave? So the message is coming into you. When the neurotransmitter activates the neuron, that's when you're suddenly like, okay, fine, we're going to do the wave. And the message gets sent down the axon. So if you think about a bunch of people doing the wave, right, what happens is that message gets sent down in little chunks. And so it ripples like a wave would down the axon. Now, if we're unmyelinated, it's really slow. You gotta, like, one arm at a time, kind of do the wave. If we're myelinated, it's much quicker. Okay, up and we're done. What happens when you're at the top is when you have this sort of sodium-potassium pump. Okay, so things are getting pushed out of the neuron, things are coming into the neuron to help move that process along. Okay? When you put your arms down, that's when the neuron is done and it's moving on to the next neuron. And there's this weird little period between firings that the neuron refuses to fire. So there is a time period in which basically it can't do anything but sort of chill out. And so that's when you put your arms back down and go, I can't believe we just did that. Okay, so it moves like a wave and is called the action potential. So the whole thing is electric. So it's caused by an influx of positive ions, that's the sodium-potassium stuff. There is a specific threshold. Okay, so thresholds are like the minimum level that you have to reach to be able to have the neuron fire. In the beginning of that video sort of shows where it had one little person moving and that wasn't quite enough, so I've got to have more people. So you do have to reach that threshold before the action potential will go. So it's an all or none response, so sort of like guns. They either fire, and that's the term that most people use, or they don't fire. So if there's not enough positive influx of, electricity, it just doesn't do anything. So there's no halfway response. So what happens next? So we have a little neuron here, and here's two of them connected together, so you can see, you get a little bit of a better idea. And then when it gets down here to, this says synaptic knob, terminal button, there is a space between the two. So here are all of my neurotransmitters hanging out. Here are all of my receptor sites. And this is the synapse, the little space in between them. So it's really very tiny. And so what happens after the action potential and the Mexican wave moves on, this is a chemical process. Neurotransmitters are sent out into the synapse that contain the message. Do this next, don't do this next, be happy, those sorts of things. Okay? So the axon terminals will release those neurotransmitters into the synapse, and then the neurotransmitter binds to the receptors that it fits. So each neurotransmitter type has a specific receptor that it fits. They're lock and key. They fit together in a specific way. So here's another set of videos. A set of pictures. So here's some examples. Here's the little synapse, and then here's the receptors. Okay, so some examples. Serotonin, which has been linked to schizophrenia and depression. Dopamine's the happy drug, so it's been linked to depression ones as well. And epinephrine is what your EpiPens are. That's adrenaline. And then just your basic endorphins. Okay, do I have one more? Yeah, and then hormones. So all of these are different types of neurotransmitters in the brain and across the body. Mostly these two are in the brain. And they're helping send messages that tell the next cell what to do. And that is when I was talking earlier about an emergent process. What happens is our brain interprets all of these cells firing as what's going on around us. So some examples of neurotransmitters. The big thing to get in this section, because we're going to move on to the brain, is that the action potential is electric, and then the connection between the two cells is chemical. Okay, so electrochemical process. All these little cells are what makes up what you're thinking. So isn't that sort of neat that each one of these little pieces is me moving my hands around right now, and what I'm thinking about, and how you're hearing me is so many pieces at once. So it's brain's kind of amazing. Alright, so let's move on to the bigger pieces of the brain, the lobes. And the nervous system. Right. Okay, so for the nervous system, we have the central nervous system, that is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, neck down. Okay. And not a whole bunch on the peripheral nervous system, but just kind of a cool picture. So brain and spinal cord is the central nervous system. We're mostly going to talk about the brain because it's the focus of cognition's work. But then we also have the peripheral nervous system. So if you've ever gotten that like sick to your stomach feeling, you say, oh, I'm really nervous, but I don't know why. That has a lot to do with some of the autonomic systems. So it's not that the peripheral system is not interesting, it's that most of the work we think goes on in the actual brain, but some of it is an interpretation of things going on below the neck. Mostly we're going to focus on the brain and spinal cord. But in the peripheral nervous system, we've got the autonomic system. That's your organs and glands. Kind of sounds like automatic. That's what it's for. The somatic system is the more voluntary system, the things that I am under control. In the autonomic system, there's the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. The sympathetic system is when you're awake and alert and doing things. Parasympathetic system is the more downtime one. So if you ever feel really sleepy after you eat, that's because your parasympathetic system is like, digest, go to sleep so we can digest. But like I said, mostly we're going to focus on this little blue stuff here. Alright, so let's look into the lobes. Alright, I've got this pretty lobe picture in my, let's see if it'll load here. In my Word doc that I've put online for you, I have another one that you can sort of label if you want. Mostly you're going to want to fill in this table when we get to the next section. So this module and the next with this worksheet here. So let me go back to my lobes. Right. Swap. There we go. Okay, we're going to talk about each one of these pieces one at a time. So you may want to save this slide somewhere and then come back to it because I'm going to have each piece on a different slide, but we're going to start here in the front. Alright, so the frontal lobes, here, on your head, forehead, here-ish. At the very back has the primary motor cortex, that's why it says posterior. So it's kind of where you would have a headband if you were wearing a headband, so here-ish. And what the primary motor cortex does, unsurprisingly, is control muscle movements. So all those muscle neurons, or the motor neurons, sorry, are connected. So if I'm moving my hands here, it's connected to all those inner neurons, comes up to my brain goes, hands moving, neat. Okay, so it's all right here, the motor cortex. The prefrontal cortex, often abbreviated PFC, is here in the front, the anterior system, so kind of here. The way to think about the prefrontal cortex is that it controls attention-based systems. So what am I thinking? What do I want to do? So like kind of temple-ish, and helps you focus on things, abstract thinking, judgments are all there, that kind of stuff. Specific spot in the front that's super important right here on this left side. Unless you're left-handed like me, then it's on both sides or maybe the right. Lefties are weird. So it's called Broca's. Broca's does what am I hearing? Or not what am I hearing, sorry, backwards. It does what do I want to say in response to what I'm hearing. So it's sort of the like thinking of what you're going to say in response to someone's talking to you. And Broca's is named after the guy who discovered Broca's. It's usually considered an aphasia. So if you break this part of your brain, you have trouble thinking of what to say to people when they're talking to you. Okay. And I think I've got that here on the side. So the prefrontal cortex does the abstract thinking and attention. And then Broca's is considered the speech production area. What do I want to say? It's all up here in the front. Motor cortex, prefrontal cortex, Broca's. Broca's is close, if not in the prefrontal cortex. It's okay, they sort of overlap. Alright, parietal lobes, here, okay, at the top, so this area of your brain. In the front, right behind the motor cortex, is the somatosensory area. That's a really long phrase for sensory cortex. So the front right here does motors, what's going on, what's moving. This right here does a lot of the sensing. Okay, so what am I feeling at the time? The sensory area does everything from taste to balance to all these different things. Right behind it, in a similar vein to spatial processing. So this is like the crown of your head. And by spatial processing, I mean where are things in my visual field. So if I want to pick up my glass so I can take a drink of water, you have to figure out where that is so you can get to the grasping motion, which again would be motor cortex. And so that helps you figure out where things are. Okay, so it's the aware system. The other thing is that the parietal lobe rests on top of the hippocampus, which we'll get to here in a minute, and that helps organize memory. It's not one specific memory. If you have seen Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, great movie, not the way the brain works at all. Okay? And so it's not like third birthday, first car, what's that password again? It's more of a system of like, okay, here's how I've organized these specific memories. So the parietal lobe is kind of big on memory as well. So specifically, search and retrieval processes. So go back to the first notes, processing system. So it helps pull things out of long-term memory so you can use them. So somebody asks you, have you seen the new movie? You can remember if you've seen it or not. And then storage. Alright, so here's a picture going back to the beginning. So here's the motor cortex here in the front, and here's the sensory cortex in the back. So all this is frontal lobe, this back here-ish parietal lobe. And what's really neat about both these systems is that it has a sort of evolutionary process where the more important things, or the things that you use more with your body have more neurons devoted to them. And you see this in expertise as well. So if you have an athletic expertise, the areas that get worked the most have more neurons than a non-athletic person. So there are a whole lot of neurons devoted to the face. There's lots of sensation that goes on in the face. There are lots and lots of muscles that control all the little eyebrow movements, all of the lip movements that help us understand emotion. Not so much when you get to like your arms and body, right? Because there's not a lot of sensation. There is a lot of motor movement, but not a lot. It's the big muscle groups and not all the little muscle groups like in your hand. So it's kind of neat. If you were to map the body based on the number of neurons that you get for each system, you would get this picture. So our face and our hands probably have the most neural connections devoted to them because of how important they are for the things that we do. Okay, so kind of cool stuff. Alright, the occipital lobes, here in the back of the brain, here. If you've ever wondered why people, when they hit the back of their head, will black out, that's because all of the visual system is here in the back. Why? Why does it make any sense? The seeing is up here. Why is the visual system here in the back? And that's also an evolutionary protection system. If you got hit in the front of your head, you wouldn't lose sight. You could still keep running away. So that is supposed to help you because it is harder to hit that spot of your head. Now this harder being without cars or football games, to lose what's going on in the visual system. That's a harder place to hit because of the way our heads are shaped. And so the occipital lobe, occi meaning eye, does all the visual system stuff. So it controls all the seeing, the direction of attention. So I talked about how attention's here in the front. This is more, I'm going to pay attention over here, I'm going to look over here, that sort of thing. So occipital lobe, all eyeballs. Now the cool thing about the occipital lobe is the connection between the eyes, which we'll talk a little bit when we get to perception, to the occipital lobe does this cool thing called crossover. This is in the lateral geniculate nucleus, which I can't spell, so LGN. And what happens is that after it gets processed in the eyes, the left visual field of both eyes goes to the right, and the right visual field of both eyes goes to the left. So it's not quite as simple as left eye right, right eye left. It's sort of like left here to the right, right here to the left. So it crosses over. So again, it's amazing we see anything, because what happens is that, first of all, it's upside down. We'll get to that when we talk about eyes. And then it's like all scrambled. So what happens is that as it passes through the parietal lobe here, it gets a spatial tag. Here's where this thing is in space. And then when it hits the occipital lobe, your brain goes, okay, all these tags, here's the picture. So what happens is that, yeah, it crosses over, and yes, it's upside down, but your occipital lobe helps you put all that back together by looking at what's going on in the parietal lobe. And so that's why sometimes you miss things, because they have the wrong spatial tag on them. Last but not least, temporal lobes, here by your ears. Okay, so temporal lobes. And those things also helpfully all things hearing. So the auditory cortex is here in the temporal lobes by your ears, so that'll help you remember it. The other special area, there's two special areas here. One of them, again on the left side, unless you're left-handed, is Wernicke's. It's kind of by your left ear. So you got Broca's here in the front, Wernicke's here in the back. And what Wernicke's does is it's what are people saying to me. So speech understanding, speech comprehension. The way I remember this is if you've seen the Charlie Brown cartoons, the teachers always sound like wonk, 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 wonk. So Wernicke's, if you don't have that system, is like constant Charlie Brown. What are these people saying to me? Okay. So if you break this area, you have a hard time understanding what people are saying to you, and you tend to just sort of say nonsense things back because you didn't process what they were saying. The other cool area in the temporal lobe is the face recognition system. It's called the fusiform gyrus. And what happens is that area is important in understanding what faces look like, but recognizing faces that are familiar to you. So there's an Oliver Sacks book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And that's about when the fusiform gyrus breaks. So you can't recognize famous faces, your family, your friends, just faces are a mess. And so there is some treatment for this sort of issue, but it tends to be based on other visual cues that are not tied to a face. So a family member will always wear a specific item or necklace or something to help you recognize. And so remember, temporal lobes here. Oh, there's the fusiform gyrus, that's how you spell it. And then last but not least, the temporal lobe is actually connected to the hippocampus. So I said the parietal lobe sits on top of the hippocampus, while the temporal lobe is on either side. And so it helps with memory, sort of, not quite the storage and retrieval, but memory, like putting it into storage. So it's sort of the memory workhorse, if you will. Alright, so to recap. this one. Let me back up a couple slides, or here, I can look at this one. We have got, this one's flipped, so see if we can do this. This is the frontal lobe, and it's going to have the motor cortex here. It's going to have Broca's here on the front, prefrontal cortex doing attention. This here is the parietal lobe. It's going to have the somatosensory area here on the front, and it's going to handle like memory and spatial orientations. The occipital lobe here in the back is going to do everything visual. The temporal lobes here on the side. Wernicke's is sort of here in the middle, and it's also connected to the memory systems. Okay. All right. So let's bring up my slides back. Okay. So everything we've just talked about is the wrinkly part of the brain. It's called the cortex. It sits on top of the brain stem. So there's some areas as part of the brain stem that's not connected to the lobes of the brain that are pretty important. There are a bunch. We're going to cover a couple. Okay. So this is the area below the cortex. Remember, the cortex is the wrinkly part that you think of when you think brains. Right? The important few. The hippocampus, we've talked about a couple times already, is the memory system. Now the way I learned the hippocampus is that it's the refrigerator. This is a little odd, but what happens is that memories, when they're getting stored in long-term memory, come into the hippocampus and sort of sit and wait. So they're kind of like Jell-O in your fridge. If you don't leave them in there long enough, they don't solidify and you have no Jell-O. And so anytime you have a concussion or bad accident, you can basically break your fridge for a while. So you can lose the ability to either form new memories. That's called anterograde amnesia. That's what the movie Memento and 50 First Dates are about. Or you can have retrograde amnesia, where you sort of forget the things that happened to you recently because the Jell-O never formed. Okay, so the hippocampus is the memory. It's not where memories are created. It's sort of where memories are made permanent. Okay. The other one is the amygdala. Okay. This is terribly stereotypical, but it's a good way to remember. This looks like a girl's name, Amy G. Dalla, and it's the emotion system. Okay, so the amygdala is this area of the brain that helps regulate emotion. So when you're angry, or when you're frustrated, when you're happy, and people whose amygdalas are broken show flat affect. They don't have any emotions. So it's potentially one of the things that you see in schizophrenia. So just remembering the hippocampus and the amygdala. There's a bunch more in the book, the limbic system, the reticular formation, just hippocampus and amygdala. Alright, so we've done neurons to lobes to the subcortical areas. Now what? The hemispheres. Okay, so we're getting bigger. The hemispheres are both halves of the brain. So the brain's actually two pieces connected together. And all of those areas that I've talked about, the temporal lobe, parietal lobe, are mirrored. So I have a frontal lobe on both sides. The only things that aren't mirrored are Broca's and Wernicke's. And some people they are, most of the time right-handed people they're not. So both sides have those lobes and the subcortical areas. So you have a left and right hippocampus. But they do tend to specialize. So those sort of left is language, right is space. That's pretty true. Alright, so how do they talk to each other? So I have these two lobes and they're just chilling in my brain. What happens that helps them connect to each other? Because we've already talked about how the left side of the eye goes to the right side. Most people can remember from basic biology that the left motor cortex controls the right side of the body. So they have to speak somehow, otherwise you wouldn't coordinate. Okay. I just said that. Let's see. Alright, it's the Corpus Callosum. Okay. So what happens is we have this special sort of set of neurons here in the middle that controls the connection between the hemispheres. So it's got millions of myelinated axons. It's one of the first things that myelinates, except the occipital lobe that actually myelinates first. So myelination occurs from the bottom up, essentially. And it's the way that the two sides communicate to each other. If it's severed, okay, severed meaning cut. Now, why would you cut this? This is the communication system. That seems like a dumb idea. Often what will happen in epilepsy, fairly severe epilepsy, is you'll have seizures that start on one side. And the seizures are so bad that they travel to both sides of the brain. And you're basically, instead of damaging just one area, unfortunately, you're damaging the whole brain. So sometimes people will have their corpus callosum cut to help control the effects of a disorder that they have, so especially epilepsy. You can lose corpus callosum pieces from what's called Korsakoff syndrome or encephalitis. Korsakoff syndrome is formed by a severe alcoholism, not the sort of thing you do in college, very severe alcoholism. Alright, so what happens if it's cut? If we sever the pathway between these two things. Remember, this pathway is important because the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body and vice versa. What's really neat is that somebody's already done this. So Sperry's split brain experiments, so Sperry's an important name. He did a lot of work on people who had their corpus callosum cut. So here's a person and they've got a little screen here, and they're asked to look at these objects and then pick up the object that's on this picture. So what happens is, let's say I've got this picture here, and it's going to go to the right side of my brain. So my right side of my brain is going, spoon, spoon, it's a spoon. But the left side of my brain is the one that controls what do I want to say. Remember, that's Broca's. And so right side of my brain is going spoon, but there's no connection to the left side that says, say it's a spoon. You know it's a spoon. So there's no way for split brain patients to name objects shown on the right hemisphere. And we just went over why, because the speaking it out loud part's on the left. Okay, so the the left side, oops, typo, couldn't tell your brain to say the word spoon because your right brain is the one that says, look, spoon, this side I can't form the word spoon. But one quick thing is that the right side of your brain could tell the left side of your body. So remember, this motor cortex controls the left side. I haven't severed the connection to my arm, just between the two, and so they could pick up the object they see but couldn't tell you what it was. So the whole idea of the corpus callosum is really about those interconnected moments that I have to have the what am I seeing, and then this side of my brain is the one that says here's what I'm gonna say, but those two aren't connected. But I could, solution to the problem, turn my head and get that information coming into the right visual field, so it comes to the left side, and then I could say spoon. So it's really this specific, very specific issue. You do see some loss of a little bit of coordination because your left and right side can't quite coordinate movements, but it's not totally noticeable because you've been doing it your whole life, so you got lots of practice usually by the time that you have one of these kind of surgeries. So there is it helped us define what exactly goes on each side because we can see these sort of deficits when people have this particular problem. Okay. So in summary of this section, our neurons are transmission systems. They are these special mechanisms to transfer information. That's the action potential and the synapses and the neurotransmitters. So those are the little building blocks of thought and movement. Those bigger areas, so the areas of the brain, so we've collectively named the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal lobes as a way to think about these neuron groupings that do specific things. So this is just a bunch of neurons that all do vision. And then there are two halves of the brain, and those are mirrored. So each half does have specific goals, like left tends to be more language oriented, right tends to be more spatial oriented, but vision's still on both sides. So why in the world would you study all of this stuff? We're going to get into cognitive neuroscience in the next section on why and how we study these specific areas.